We acknowledge that we record this on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day everyone, g'day Liz.
G'day.
How are you? Panicking?
No, not yet. I'm swimming.
Welcome back to our next main series episode of Mindcraft. Liz, today I've chosen on the Multiplicity of Consciousness by Sydney Carls-Diamante, which was recently published in Phil Psych.
Am I allowed to call her Sid?
I am going to, and on that note, we should say that Sid is someone that we have both published within the past, though given that we tend to try and be pretty positive in these things anyway, I don't think our biases are going to be different or more evident than usual. Plus, we have the benefit that Sid can just get in the comments and tell us when we get anything wrong. I want to start by going into some of the terminology that Sid uses. She wants to challenge here the default assumption that consciousness is unitary and unified. So Liz, how would you phrase those assumptions based on those words? What do you think that she means?
Well, it would be the sort of assumption that is in tension with, say, the split brain stuff that we were talking about in 101 last time, where it seems like there might well make the most sense to say that there's two streams of consciousness in somebody in that context.
That's going to be one of the examples that Sid works with.
So what unified and what was the other word?
Unitary.
Unitary, so only one.
One, yeah.
This is a common assumption because all you can tell me about is your one unified, unitary stream of consciousness. But once we begin to probe things in a bit more detail, it turns out that that's not obviously correct.
That's where Sid's going to take us. Just to reiterate that, if we accept these assumptions, we're accepting that any conscious subject, so a conscious being, has one unified consciousness. Bain puts it like this. This is a quote that Sid uses. So, quote, necessarily for any conscious subject of experience S and any time T, the simultaneous conscious states that S has at T will be subsumed by a single conscious state, the subject's total conscious state, end quote. Sid points out that this quote from Bain is a particularly strong version of the assumption, because it's making claims about the necessary features of consciousness. It starts with him saying necessarily for any conscious subject. But it's also incomplete because we can also talk about the unity of consciousness across time as a single stream of consciousness rather than its unity at a particular time. There's a bunch of different terms we can use for these two notions. Sid mostly uses unity for how consciousness is supposedly unified and unitary, so unified and singular at a particular time. And another term which is inherited from elsewhere, which is a bit hard to say, which is unicity, which is how consciousness appears to be unified across time. Unicity, so unity across time, she takes to be needed for a subjective perspective. This is tied to her reading of Pachetti, and I think is a version of a representationalist idea of what a subjective point of view is. So she says, quote, a stream of consciousness can be understood as the set of all and only those co-conscious states. That's another one of those terms for unity at a particular moment. Those co-conscious states that comprise a single subjective perspective, end quote. So I think this is you are made of your conscious mental state sort of idea. And then we add in this quote this is taken from Pachetti. If one also recognizes that unity is not the same as unicity, one can separate the question of whether consciousness must be unified from the question of whether there can be only one such conscious center per organism, end quote. So I think she's reading conscious center in this Pachetti quote as a stream of consciousness, rather than, say, a particular consciousness making mechanism, which is another term for those familiar with other debates in this area, which talks more about how many dissociable mechanisms there are which underlie consciousness, which is a slightly different question, sort of in the same area. This terminology gets us to the topic of the paper, which is to challenge the idea that there need only be one stream of consciousness within an organism. To challenge what Sid is calling, following Pachetti, unicity. The possibility she wants us to get to is of the multiplicity of consciousness being the existence of multiple streams of consciousness within a single organism. This, of course, would also imply a degree of disunity at a particular time. In a being with two streams of consciousness, one stream of consciousness at a single moment would represent different things than the other would. So you got two, one stream is representing, for example, what's presented to your left visual hemifield, and the other is representing what's presented to your right visual hemifield. If these are distinct streams, any sharing of information between them would not be via them using shared representations, but would involve a process more like communication.
So if getting information from one side to the other of my split brain requires the same sort of communication as would be required to get information from me to Glenn, then it's not a unified consciousness.
I'm not sure that Sid's so explicit that that would be the test that she would use, but I think that's a fair reading of what we've said so far, that it could be. A few different things would count as multiplicity for Sid. In a hypothetical case Sid calls conscious symmetry, each stream would be capable of supporting the same types of content. In an alternative called lateralized consciousness, there'd be some content, say linguistic representation, which is specific to a particular stream. In these cases, the streams are defined entirely by considerations of the contents of consciousness, so what is experienced. In the third case, streams are defined by such contents and on anatomical grounds. This Sid calls heterogeneous consciousness, and is a hypothetical case in which anatomical differences underlying each stream are responsible for difference in contents. Let's have a look at each of these possibilities, starting with conscious symmetry. In a case of conscious symmetry, there would be multiple streams of consciousness within an organism that are capable of supporting all the same types of experience. They would, however, be differentiated by supporting different token experiences and the causal relations those experiences enter into. We're being asked to imagine an organism with, say, two consciousness-making mechanisms within it, each of which can produce the same kind of experience, but which don't influence each other. Perhaps both these consciousness-making mechanisms produce colour experiences, but a colour experience in one stream doesn't affect colour experience in the other. Where the same colour experience occurs in each stream, it's just because both streams are representing the same stimuli. But if a different stimuli is presented to the different streams, they will have distinct experiences. Sid attributes to Pachetti an interpretation of split brain subjects that falls under this category. We've talked about split brain subjects recently in the new paper series and in the 101, so there's no need to go back over that in great detail. Listen to the most recent Bars episode for it. We're talking about the same group of subjects here. According to Sid, Pachetti interprets these cases as showing that The normal case in humans is that we have two separate streams of consciousness underlain by each hemisphere of the cerebral cortex, but that usually there is an exchange of information via the corpus callosum. When those connections are severed, we now have two distinct consciousness-making mechanisms that can't share information with each other via the corpus callosum, and so this becomes a case of conscious symmetry.
So does symmetry imply identity? Like they're identical?
No, that they're capable of producing the same sorts of representations.
As in the same type?
The same type, yeah.
Right.
The same type of experiences.
I don't know the data on split brain enough to know whether it's true that they can produce entirely the same. I also don't know that it matters.
Let's spend some time with that, because this will help us get our head around the different concepts of multiplicity that Sid is suggesting. The conscious symmetry reading of split brain here is thinking about the visual experiences each stream can have.
Oh, it's symmetrical just with regard to vision.
Yeah.
They can't produce language.
Yeah,
so.
which is where we're going. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the idea here is that most of the time the visual experiences of each stream are the same or similar enough to not create conflict in how each hemisphere of the cortex responds. Because, of course, most of the time things aren't neatly presented just to one half of the visual field. And even if that happens, people can just move their head or their eyes to change where the visual hemifields map onto the world.
So this is a good point, and part of why most of the time having your corpus callosum severed doesn't actually impact your everyday functioning.
It's only in lab conditions then where different information can actually be presented to just one hemifield at a time, where we get a case where each stream produces a different token experience. I don't want to spend heaps of time getting into criticizing that particular idea unless you're desperate to.
No, I just want to flag that I'm not sure it's obviously true, but I'm also not sure it matters. So I'm happy to follow your lead on whether it matters.
I think all we're doing at this point in the paper is looking at some proposals about what multiplicity of consciousness could be like. This is sort of helpful enough for describing a possibility. The debate will advance at some point, of course, to which, if any, of the possibilities are true. But Sid's agenda here is wanting to raise the possibility of more radically disunified consciousness in octopuses. And so her strategy to try and get that on the table is to look at a few different proposals as to what multiplicity could be, and then see which ones could possibly apply to octopuses. A lateralized consciousness interpretation of split brain experiences is more common than the conscious symmetry one, for the reason that you mentioned before, Liz, that the different halves of the cerebral cortex seem to have different linguistic capabilities in most people. Some people are. It is shared. A lateralized consciousness reading of split brain experiences, again, the supposition is that there are multiple streams of consciousness, one associated with each half of the cerebral cortex. However, there are differences in what types of experiences each stream can have. So, some theorists have proposed, based on the linguistic reporting capacities of split brain subjects, but also plenty of other data on the neural correlates of linguistic ability, that only the left hemisphere in these cases is capable of supporting a stream of consciousness that includes language. Most people, we think, are left hemisphere dominant for language. We should say that there are some people who are right hemisphere dominant, though not the people who happen to be involved in the split brain studies. And there are some people for whom both hemispheres of the cerebral cortex are important for language. But in these subjects, for people who are left hemisphere dominant, the suggestion is that the stream of consciousness dependent on the left hemisphere can include experiences of language that the stream of consciousness dependent on the right hemisphere just can't include. Similar to what we talked about a few episodes ago in White and colleagues' Corvid paper, some people have also proposed that birds have two distinct streams of consciousness for similar reasons, because they have two separate cerebral cortices that are connected by a structure analogous to a corpus callosum. Each stream then being dependent on a different hemisphere of the cerebral cortex and associated with different skills. For example, one side might be better at detecting danger and the other better at detecting food. The next proposed way of understanding multiplicity, called heterogeneous consciousness, considers factors beyond just what's the content of each stream of consciousness. The idea here is that there are differences in the contents of each stream, and that each depends on a different anatomical substrate, and that the difference in anatomy plays some role in explaining the difference in content. So if you had a good anatomical explanation for why a language was left hemisphere dominant, you'd then be offering a heterogeneous consciousness reading of the split brain subject rather than just a lateralized consciousness reading. I think from what Sid is saying here, that the anatomical role here is meant to be more than what we've already been talking about. Because she says, quote, heterogeneous consciousness arises from substrates dissimilar in structure, function, and information access, end quote. So of course, this is where we've been aiming at and why the octopus lady is interested in the issue of multiplicity. Quote, heterogeneity may arise in organisms with distributed neurocognitive systems characterized by anatomically distinct components with extensive functional specialization and autonomy, for instance, octopuses.
Oh, sorry.
Yep. And it's funny, I always thought people said octopi as a joke, but apparently some people do use it because they think it's a Latin root word. It's not, it's an ancient Greek. That's not very important. Alright, so we're getting into the meat of the issues now. And of course Sid's going to hedge a bit here. I assume there's a bit of like toning it down to make it easier to publish the proposal and so on going on here. She's not going to try and convince us that octopuses have multiple consciousness, say a brain consciousness and an arm consciousness or something like that, but she is trying to get that option on the table here. So not saying that we know this is the case, but rather that there is reasons to think that it might be and it needs to be examined. This is driven by the nature of the octopus nervous system, which is very different from what we're more familiar with in the study of humans and other vertebrates. I'll do this very quickly. Sid does this quite quickly in this paper. She has other papers which I think are part of this project of trying to look at a typical or model octopus nervous system and then ask questions about what their consciousness might be. So she offers more detail into the nervous systems there. I'll just go quickly through some of the broader claims about it here. So there are three major divisions of the nervous system in octopuses. The first is called the brain. That contains around 9 to 10% of the neural cell body, so it's quite small. We then have the optic lobes, which contain, I worked this out just sort of from the numbers that she put in the paper. Of course, octopuses have quite a lot of variety. So the optic loads contain around 24 to 36% of the neural cell bodies. And then we have the arm nervous system, which contains the vast majority of the cell bodies. Here we're talking about some 350 million neurons with an even spread around the 8 arms. There is a link between the brain and the arm nervous system. This is called the axial nerve cord, and this transmits signals from the brain to the arms, but it is also said to integrate information from the arms. So I think the suggestion there is that sensory input, for example, from each arm is unified into a single representation within this system, or starts to come together within this nerve before it gets to the brain. Some of the control functions, which in vertebrates depend on the central nervous system, so the brain and spinal cord, in octopuses are implemented in the arm nervous system. Now, because octopuses are not vertebrates, there's no easy way to draw analogies between the central peripheral distinction that we use for vertebrates in octopuses. But I will note, though, that despite that difficulty, there is a part of the octopus nervous system which they call the brain, and the arm nervous system is sometimes called the peripheral nervous system. So some people at least are seeing some analogies there. Anyway, that's just an aside. But the point is that there's going to be some motor control functions which in us depend on parts of our brain and our spinal cord, which in the octopus depend on the arm nervous system. One of the examples here is of motor commands that elicit a stereotyped movement. So in a human, a typical example of this would be a stepping movement. In us, these are dependent on the central nervous system, with the spinal cord playing a big role. Liz, if you remember this idea of central pattern generators in neuroscience, which produce rhythmic outputs for motor control, we get them through the brainstem and the spinal cord. In octopuses, though, these aren't brain dependent or anything analogous to a spinal cord dependent. They depend on the arm nervous system. But the claim here is more than just the arm nervous system has central pattern generators, because if we think about a motion that an octopus might need to do to get its arm into a position where then this sort of stereotyped rhythmic motion can be useful, that act of getting the arm into position is also strongly dependent on the arm nervous system. So I think the claim here, and Sid can come and correct us on this, is that the arm nervous system in octopuses is responsible for things that in us depend on the spinal cord, but also things that depend on the cerebellum and the motor cortices. Things are about to get more interesting because we're about to learn about some behavioral data. Sid says, quote, "The most compelling basis for speculation about arm-based consciousness includes early findings that amputated octopus arms exhibit behavioral and sensory responses to stimuli identical to those of an intact animal." End quote.
So in humans, when you split the brain, the part of the brain that can't talk to you still does things, pretty smart things. In octopuses, you cut the leg off and it does smart things. Yeah?
So my understanding is that this is specifically about responses to painful stimuli, and that the claim is that a single amputated arm will show the same responses as the whole organism. So if you just...
It'll pull away from a painful stimulus.
Yeah, but in a way that is indistinguishable from how the single arm pulls away from a painful stimuli when it's attached.
Are there other species where it pulls away but it's not indistinguishable?
I don't know.
Because From how you're putting it, it seems like that a lot's been made of it being indistinguishable. But maybe that's a distinction without a difference. There aren't examples where you cut it off and it is different. Yeah?
Possibly. I think the suggestion is, and again, Sid can correct me on this if I'm wrong, that a whole octopus, if it has this right kind of painful stimulus, that the whole organism will respond with just the arm that the painful stimulus is applied to, and no other part of it will respond.
Right, okay.
I think that's the sort of thing that's being claimed by the part of this claim, that the responses are identical. Alright. If an octopus or anything really has multiple streams of consciousness, we'd expect to see functional consequences to this, at least in experimental setups. Sid discusses two, which he labels multifaceted experience and coherent behavior. So we'll just finish up by having a look at these, because I think that the long-term goal will be that it's through detecting these functional differences that we would be able to find evidence one way or the other for disunity within an octopus. In humans, split brain scenarios are sometimes interpreted as a breakdown of what Sid's calling multifaceted experience. Here, meaning that certain sensory signals fail to enter the stream of consciousness. This would be in experimental circumstances. And if we think about a case where someone who's had their corpus callosum severed is presented with a word just to their right hemisphere, so to their left visual hemifield, that word then is one that the subject can't report. It just can't get into their stream of consciousness. Now, that's not to say that that's the right understanding of split brain cases, because of course, and we talked about these earlier on, Liz, there are those who suppose that the right hemisphere is its own consciousness-making mechanism that's just separate from language. But that interpretation of the scenario would be what Sid's talking about as a breakdown in multifaceted experience.
If you say that there's only one consciousness in split brain people, then you're saying that there's a failure of multifaceted consciousness? Because there's all this other info that can't make it?
Yes.
That's the argumentative function.
Sid's using, I think, different interpretations or potential understandings of what it's like for split brain subjects to sort of motivate different possibilities that we can potentially apply to octopuses. She wants to get on the table here that this failure to integrate some aspects of the sensory world into a unified, multifaceted experience is the normal state of affairs for some animals. So if we go back to the lateralized consciousness scenario, I think we can see how this would work. Think of a bird that uses one eye to search for food and another eye to watch for danger. Here, information about each, so food and danger, doesn't need to be unified into a single stream, but it's still present and processed. A potential advantage to this is that if each stream is associated with separate mechanisms of attention, both the food search and the danger watching could each get all the attention that they need. And it's something that we can't do. But of course, the question then would be, if that setup were implemented, what would happen when each stream causes different behaviors? So this is what Sid's talking about in terms of the functional consequences to coherent behavior. Here the idea is that consciousness typically functions to unify information to produce a single coherent response for the organism. So in an experiment with a split brain subject, if we think about the scenario that we talked about in the recent bars episode, where they're shown a snowy scene to their left visual hemifield and a chicken foot to their right visual hemifield, and then asked to pick up the object that matches what they see, and they pick up a chicken and a snow shovel, they'd be understood as having a breakdown in their coherent behavior because they're producing multiple behaviors, each in response to the different streams. So this could potentially speak against the functionality of having multiple disunified streams of consciousness within an organism. But Sid wants to suggest that this is especially confusing to us because of our bodies, and that when you consider organisms that have radically different bodies to ours, that what in us would be an incoherent response isn't so much of a problem. Quote, "The worry lies in the assumption that multiple conscious streams may require different sets of complex motor responses, often simultaneously and sometimes incongruous. Furthermore, in humans, the body plan limits the number of complex motor tasks that can be executed at a given time. When multiple streams call for distinct behavioral responses, a human might not carry these out effectively. Moreover, since complex actions often call for coordinated use of the effectors, a human might not always be able to complete the tasks required by the conscious streams, for example, bimanual tasks that need to be performed simultaneously. There is also concern that the motor system would receive conflicting instructions as to which actions to execute. Consequently, even if a human did have multiple streams of consciousness, she might not be able to act on them effectively." End quote. So I think the idea here is that because we can't do things like do two lots of two-handed actions simultaneously, if we need to do anything at all, like if you think about just writing, you need to position your whole body in a position to be able to do that. Because we have this sort of body that's designed to respond as a whole to so many things, the idea of us having, as the typical case at least, multiple streams of consciousness seems maladaptive. But that's because we have a kind of mind that fits with the sort of body we have.
If we had 8 arms that would work independently, we might be happier with a more disunified take.
Coming back to the octopuses, as you say, Liz, we see a kind of animal capable of performing multiple distinct actions simultaneously. Of course, they're not completely independent. Even in the case of single-arm actions, the rest of the body needs to be maintained in a position to allow the action, so it can't grab something and swim away from it. So we'd still need some sort of hub, as Sid puts it, whose functions, quote, include integrating and remediating the contents of different streams, for example, eliminating redundancies and resolving putative inconsistencies before the consolidated information is transmitted to other consuming systems, so back out to the arms, end quote. In the bird example, if it does turn out that they have one stream for detecting danger and another one for detecting food, this hub would be what prioritizes responding to a detected predator over tasty food. If we're going to look for multiple streams of consciousness in octopuses, we also need to find some sort of mediating hub like this.
Why do we need to find a mediating hub?
Because there needs to be something that prioritizes responses.
Why can't there just be a babble?
The bird case is sort of interesting here, because if it did turn out that you had one stream that was detecting danger and another one that was looking for food, when the bird detects danger, it flies away
and stops looking for
food. But that's not a lateralized response. That's a whole body response. I think we can imagine architectures that don't require a unifying hub.
So why can't we just say that one of the arms by itself is conscious?
I think that is what Sid wants us to think.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Right. I'm losing track of what's been endorsed as opposed to explored in order to be rejected.
Yeah. And it is quite an exploratory paper. So it is looking at really, 5 different ideas about what multiplicity might be if we're going to go looking for it in octopus consciousness. Sid's very careful and conservative in the conclusions in this paper, but I think that one possibility that she wants to get on the table is that there are these separate streams of consciousness, one for each arm and another one for the brain. But if we think about this idea of the hub as integrating and remediating the different streams, we might think of that as conscious selection, but that could be completely unconscious as well. So whatever picks between responses needn't be itself experienced. You needn't know how you choose between different responses.
I think I'm going to say, oh, Sid, it's such a pity you had to be so cautious. But it's not Sid's fault.
Yeah, I mean, it's a matter of what's the evidence and where's it at, and it's not clear enough to justify a claim of multiplicity. And I think Sid would say that's because we've got all these different ideas about what multiplicity could be, and how we go looking for them is quite different. So if you go looking for something that's just like a conscious symmetry approach, where you have multiple mechanisms all capable of producing the same kinds of content, then the considerations of neuroanatomy would be irrelevant to that. You'd need to just do behavioral stuff to try and isolate the different streams and give them different token experiences. But if you go looking for something that's multiple in the heterogeneity sense, then the different functional capacities of different parts of the octopus nervous system, for example, would be directly relevant. So the kinds of evidence that we would go looking for would be different depending on which of these different notions of multiplicity we thought was at play.
The Quinean in me worries this is too a priori.
Right, so I don't think that she's doing anything like saying, here's the different concepts of multiplicity, we need to decide amongst them and then go looking for them. I think she's saying there are these different notions of multiplicity for which different kinds of evidence will be relevant, and that if we were to do something that would, say, only rule out one of the notions, then that's not settling the issue. So if we had a notion that was tied to coherent behavior as one of the functions of consciousness, and then showed that octopuses do this whole body coherent behavior responses to some things and whatnot, that's not ruling out all the different kinds of multiplicity, because we still have this idea of unconscious selection between outcomes. The idea is, do octopuses have multiple streams of consciousness? That possibility is on the table, but importantly, there could be several different ways of implementing multiplicity. With that, let's call it a day. Next time out will be a 101 episode that Liz will lead on representations in general. Thank you, Liz. Thank you, everyone. And I would note that Sid has never been known to beat anyone to death for saying octopi instead of octopuses, but allegedly has for people calling octopus arms tentacles. Is that satisfactory?
Yeah, I'm just lost because I'm an idiot.
Oh, lost in the game.
Yeah.
Right.
Sorry. Oh, yeah. No, that's all good. I can't follow simple coordinates.